A terrifying beginning. In the frosty quietude of January 1982, the small lakeside town of Willowville seemed like a scene painted from tranquility itself. Nestled between dense forests and the shimmering expanse of Willow Lake, it was a town where kids played in backyards till sundown, neighbors trusted each other with spare keys, and locking doors was a matter of habit, not necessity. But that trust began to erode. It started quietly, whispers of disappearances that slipped into late-night conversations over kitchen tables. Residents began to notice that young women, bright, ambitious and full of life, were vanishing without a trace. First it was Julie Foster, a talented sophomore from the local community college, who was last seen walking home from the library. Weeks later, Kara Milton, who worked part-time at a nearby diner and planned to transfer to a prestigious university, failed to show up for her evening shift. The coincidences were unsettling, but the final stretch of normalcy came to a screeching halt when a third woman, Sandra Keller, a high school senior, disappeared walking back from her friend's house. Now, nobody could deny it anymore. Something dark was unfurling its grip around Willowville. The details, or the lack thereof, were chilling. No signs of struggle, no witnesses bearing solid leads, just a name, a face, and a life snuffed out in the silence of the night. The missing women shared an unnerving similarity. Youthful faces, long brown hair parted neatly down the middle, and a gentle demeanor that made them approachable to strangers. Police, initially hesitant to see a pattern, soon realized they were dealing with more than isolated incidents when their files on these young women began to overlap like puzzle pieces. Adding to the growing unease were the sporadic accounts of an enigmatic figure. Late-night dog walkers swore they'd seen a man lurking in the shadows, his appearance always shrouded by the dim glow of streetlights. He was reportedly dressed in dark clothing, his figure lean but foreboding, his presence fleeting like a phantom that evaporated as quickly as it appeared. Some claimed he drove an old sputtering pickup truck that bore the marks of age, chipped paint, dented sides, and a persistent whine in the engine. But as vague as these sightings were, they were enough to set the town ablaze with fear and speculation. While residents fell into paranoia, the police struggled to keep pace. The lack of concrete evidence caused mounting frustration, and whatever traces were uncovered, scratches on a tree trunk, a misplaced scarf, led to dead ends. The shadow of inaction loomed large as the public questioned whether their small local force had the expertise or the willpower to take on what was shaping up to be a full-fledged nightmare. National news outlets quickly caught wind of the disappearances, painting Willowville as a town gripped by terror. Senior citizens avoided going out after sundown, market-goers glanced nervously over their shoulders, and parents clung tightly to their daughters' hands. To make matters worse, little could be done to reconcile those nagging questions. Was the predator someone from outside wandering in to wreak havoc? Or was it, perhaps more chillingly, someone among them, a community member hiding in plain sight, cloaked by familiarity? As if to heighten the dread, a cold spell swept through the region, freezing the ground and the search efforts alike. The forests surrounding the town, once a haven for birdwatchers and hikers, now felt menacing. Vast expanses of snow-covered wilderness that seemed to echo with a silence too loud to ignore. Stray footprints often led nowhere, and the icy wind swallowed sound, leaving trails and cries alike buried in frost. The final blow to the town's collective composure came one fateful February night, when local student organizations on campus began passing warnings amongst themselves. Rumors circulated about spotting a strange man on the edges of the university grounds, a man described as limping, clutching his side as if injured. A few students mentioned that he seemed approachable, even polite, but when seen up close, something about his smile was off, too calculated, too rehearsed. Willowville's shining days of innocence faded into a haunting refrain of fear, as everyone waited with bated breath for the next strike in what could only be described as the sinister prologue to a tale far darker than anyone dared to imagine. The chain of mysterious attacks. By the spring of 1982, the disappearances in Willowville were no longer isolated cases. They were part of a cruel, calculated pattern. It was as if the shadow of evil had slipped unnoticed into the sleepy town, casting a pall over what once felt like a safe haven. The predator, whom the local papers anonymously dubbed the Phantom of Willowville, showed no signs of slowing down. Each month, like clockwork, another young woman would vanish, swallowed by the darkness without warning or explanation. The victims were eerily similar. Women in their early 20s, most of them students, all of them with long dark hair. What was even more chilling was the way no one, not even the police, could spot an obvious connection between them, or a single clue about how this predator operated. The only constant was the growing terror that gripped the town. In April, residents were rocked by the discovery of 30-year-old Mary Greer, or what was left of her. She was found lying in a shallow grave near an abandoned trail in the woods. There were bruises around her wrists and neck, scraps of fabric embedded in the soil nearby, possibly from a scarf that had been used to bind her. The autopsy revealed even more horrifying details: blunt force trauma to the head and signs of prolonged struggle. But heartbreakingly, her grave also yielded no definitive forensic leads, no identifiable footprints or fibers linked to a suspect. May brought more misery when Emma Cartwright disappeared after leaving her late lecture at the local university. Emma was a well-loved history major who frequently stayed late to review archives in the campus library. The only clue found was her broken umbrella just outside the side entrance, snapped in half as though grabbed violently or perhaps dropped mid-struggle. Storm clouds rolled in that night, washing away any potential evidence left on the brick-paved courtyard. Emma's body wasn't discovered until weeks later in a ravine, almost 12 miles from her usual routes. The delay had stripped the remains of any definitive evidence, but the community noticed one mounting common denominator. This wasn't random. It was stalking. During the height of the summer season, paranoia crept into every corner of Willowville. Women stopped jogging alone, grocery stores began stocking up on mace spray, and gun sale inquiries spiked at the local sporting goods shops. But for all the efforts to protect themselves, these measures felt futile. In mid-June, the case boiled over when yet another young woman, Lila Dean, vanished in broad daylight. Just days before her planned wedding, Lila had been driving to her dress fitting. Her empty car was found abandoned on the side of the highway with no visible signs of forced entry. Her fiancé, shaken and devastated, pleaded for clues on national television, but answers never came. All the while, whispers about who might be behind these crimes grew louder. Was it someone from outside Willowville slipping into the town like a shadow and escaping unnoticed? Or was it a local, a neighbor or a store clerk or someone casually blending in with everyday life, secretly harboring darkness within? A theory began to form within the ranks of law enforcement. Investigators started to believe that the perpetrator was escalating. What began as abductions, followed by brutal murders, now showed evidence of planning and reconnaissance. Victims disappeared near populated areas, campus libraries, roadside diners, busy parking lots. The brazenness of striking amid witnesses, coupled with the subsequent meticulous attention to covering his tracks, pointed to someone dangerously calculating. Compounding the fear, a few grim patterns started to emerge. Victims almost always vanished in the dead of night or late evening, secluded spots being their abductors' preferred hunting grounds. And while the killer left little evidence behind, he appeared to toy with investigators. Scratches on tree trunks, seemingly leading toward nowhere. Dirt-smudged scarves discovered neatly placed on highways, clues just thin enough to taunt. His methods were surgical, precise. It was clear that he was getting more comfortable, and the depth of his control, the way he could make the victims seemingly disappear without a trace, sent shivers through even the most seasoned detectives. Sporadically, tips would come into the police station about suspicious characters, a disheveled man wandering the outskirts of Willowville or trucks idling late at night, but nothing stuck. Nights grew quieter, as fewer residents dared to linger outdoors past dusk. The vibrant hum of the town was reduced to abandoned streets, locked doors, and muffled sobs. The once vivid heart of Willowville swelled with unease, each home clutching its daughters tighter and praying to avoid the headlines. And then, as if the chaos wasn't already unrelenting enough, a survivor emerged. Tanya Lewis's encounter with the stranger was a turning point, an unintentional glimpse into the predator's existence. Her description of a tall man with a gentle smile, limping as if injured, didn't just add to the chilling narrative, it electrified the community. It was the first clear crack in the Phantom's ominous legacy. Since each of Tanya's details added weight to suspicions of calculated deceit, limping to appear non-threatening, for instance, it immediately bolstered the belief that this was not some random spree killer. No, this was someone thoughtful, practiced, cold. C.D. Spencer, the lead detective on the case, summed up the anxiety in one brief yet soul-chilling statement to the press. "It's not just about who he's taken, it's about who's next. My gut tells me he's watching someone new right now." The first witness. The breakthrough came late one summer evening, when a pale but determined young woman stumbled into the Willowville police station, her breath staggered, her clothes wrinkled from an evening that would haunt her for years to come. Tanya Lewis, a 22-year-old philosophy student at the local university, had become what the town desperately needed, a survivor in a sea of silence. What she had witnessed would shake the very foundation of the case. Tanya's account began with an eerily mundane setting, a quiet walk home through campus after an evening study session. She had taken the same route she always did, her headphones in, a novel tucked under her arm, the pathways dimly lit but familiar. The comforting sounds of her small town, distant crickets chirping, the occasional hum of a passing car, lulled her into a false sense of security. And then she saw him. At first glance he seemed unremarkable, a tall man dressed in dark clothes, limping slightly as he made his way toward her on the narrow path cutting through the trees. His arm was in a sling, and his face carried what she described as a faint, almost embarrassed smile. He looked vulnerable, harmless. "Excuse me, miss," he called out, his voice soft but steady. Tanya hesitated but stopped in her tracks. The man motioned toward a backpack on the ground, its contents spilling out onto the dirt. "My arm, it's useless right now. I dropped my bag and I can't seem to manage picking it all up. Mind giving me a hand?" It wasn't an unusual request. People in Willowville often stopped to help each other. She debated internally for a moment, her eyes scanning the scene. The man's leg was wrapped in what appeared to be a medical brace, his sling strapped tightly across his chest. He seemed like someone who had seen better days. Against her better judgment, Tanya nodded and crouched down to help him. That's when she felt it, the shift in the air, the prickling sensation at the back of her neck, as though warning bells were suddenly going off inside her. She glanced up and found the man staring at her, his smile now too controlled, too calculated. His eyes, Tanya would later tell the police, were lifeless, not angry, not kind, just empty. And then he moved. His injured arm wasn't injured at all. With one swift, practiced motion, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a length of cord. Tanya reacted instinctively, throwing the nearest item, a textbook, into his face. She stumbled as she stood, but the adrenaline kicked in, propelling her forward, away from him. Behind her, the man cursed under his breath, though he didn't chase her. Tanya sprinted toward a residential building not far from the library, her heart pounding wildly. She didn't stop until she reached the front steps and banged on the door, screaming for someone to help. A group of students let her in, their faces pale as they listened to her recount the encounter. Minutes later, the police were called, and Tanya found herself sitting in a fluorescent-lit room at the station, recounting every detail to Detective C.D. Spencer. "I keep thinking about his smile," she said, her voice trembling. "It wasn't a human smile, it was rehearsed, like he knew exactly what he was doing. He wanted me to trust him." The police took her statement seriously. This was the closest anyone had come to encountering the elusive predator without becoming his victim. Tanya's description of him, tall, lean, with a limp that might not even be real, finally gave investigators a concrete direction. Her story also revealed the man's cunning, the fake injury, the disarming tone, the fabricated vulnerability. This wasn't an impulsive criminal. This was someone who had perfected his act to draw in victims. But what struck Detective Spencer most wasn't just the false persona of the man, it was the precision of his timing. Tanya said she saw no one else nearby, no potential witnesses. He had chosen his moment carefully, targeting her when the path was empty, the surrounding streets quiet. It was further proof that whoever this predator was, he was watching, studying, waiting for the perfect opportunity. Tanya's courage didn't go unnoticed. Her willingness to speak up and provide details revived the stagnant investigation. Based on her description, the police created a composite sketch of the suspect, a clean-shaven man in his late 30s with angular features and piercing dark eyes. Posters went up all over Willowville, urging residents to come forward with any information about his identity. Despite her escape, Tanya couldn't shake the fear that gripped her in the days that followed. She kept her curtains drawn, avoided walking outdoors at night, and jumped at every sound outside her window. She had survived, but the scars were more than skin deep. The people of Willowville, however, saw her as a hero. Her bravery had ignited a spark of hope, a belief that the man known as the Phantom could be caught. And while Tanya moved forward cautiously, her testimony became a critical piece of the puzzle, a vivid warning of just how manipulative and dangerous the hunter in their midst truly was. Clues begin to surface. For months, the Willowville Police Department had nothing but dead ends and unanswered questions, like pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit. The terror sweeping through the town was palpable, But with no solid evidence, authorities found themselves chasing shadows. That is, until Tanya Lewis's harrowing escape sparked a ripple effect, leading to the first tangible traces of the predator the papers had dubbed the Phantom. Following Tanya's statement, the police zeroed in on her description of the man: a tall, lean figure with a fake limp, a fake injury, and soulless eyes hidden behind an unnervingly polite smile. Her recounting of his carefully crafted trap, the drop bag, the sling, and his calculated appeal for assistance, painted a picture of a predator far more cunning than they had initially imagined. He wasn't someone making sloppy mistakes or acting on impulse. This was a man who took his time, who watched, planned, and pounced when the moment was just right. But the investigation quickly proved he was also someone who lingered like a phantom, leaving nothing behind except faint echoes of his crimes. Until now. Unsettling discoveries. In the days following Tanya's escape, adrenaline coursed through the small detective team. They canvassed the area near the university paths she had described, combing through every stray branch and scrap of debris. It was during these sweeps that an officer discovered something seemingly insignificant: a strip of fabric snagged on a tree trunk near the trail's darkest bend. It looked like part of a scarf, dirt-streaked and torn, as though it had been caught in a struggle. A forensic team analyzed the fabric but found little to nothing: no fingerprints, no DNA. Frustration began to mount. Yet Spencer, the lead detective, refused to dismiss the find. He pored over their case files and noticed a chilling pattern. Similar details had been uncovered: scraps of cloth, broken jewelry, faint tire tracks, all of them dismissed as coincidental or unconnected. But now, with Tanya's story bridging the gaps, those scraps became part of a bigger narrative. This was no coincidence. Then came the vehicle description. Multiple witnesses over the months had reported seeing an old pickup truck parked idly near the scenes of the disappearances. It was typically described as battered, with chipped paint and a whining engine that echoed unnervingly in the town's quietude. But most disturbing was a newer detail surfacing from witnesses: a lingering smell of gasoline and oil wherever the truck had been parked, a marker that might narrow down its stops if residents paid attention. "Someone like this isn't too comfortable in the spotlight," Spencer told his team during their daily briefing. His voice was low, deliberate, every word carrying a weight. "He'll move in the background: gas stations, construction sites, any place he can blend in with the noise of everyday life." An evolving profile spurred by the composite sketch created from Tanya's description, the police interviewed shop owners, gas station clerks, and security guards throughout Willowville, looking for anyone who matched her details. One gas station attendee claimed a man with a limp had bought duct tape, twine, and medical gauze months ago, items that now appeared innocent but took on sinister meaning in hindsight. Another repairman recalled filling up a truck matching the description weeks before Mary Greer disappeared. The problem? None of these leads ever tied to a name, just fleeting glimpses of an unknown man who had perfected the art of passing unnoticed. Meanwhile, Spencer began to rethink the routine assumptions that had bogged them down for months. The team re-examined the timeline of the victims' disappearances, realizing that many occurred during exam seasons at the local university, when students' schedules shifted and paths became predictably deserted late at night. This wasn't random, it was a calculated hunting ground. "Our guy's not just violent," Spencer muttered under his breath during a strategy session. "He's disciplined, methodical. He's learned to predict when life is slow, when his victims will be most vulnerable. And the worst part, that tells me he's done this before, maybe even somewhere else." But then, a spark one break in the case came from an unlikely source: a local photographer who had been shooting candid images for a nature calendar near the same wooded trails where Tanya had nearly been abducted. When he heard about the incidents, he came forward to police with an image he'd captured weeks prior. At first glance, the photo seemed innocent, a scenic shot of a wooded path in the golden hour of dusk. But there on the far right edge of the frame stood the figure of a man, dressed in dark clothing, his face blurred by movement. Though the resolution was low, certain features matched Tanya's description: the height, the lean build, and the posture of someone who seemed invisible to passers-by. While not definitive evidence, the photo was enough to feed the tension spinning through Willowville. For the first time, residents felt they might not just be hallucinating or imagining the lurking threats around them. The hunt tightens. As the investigation barreled forward, Spencer began to suspect a deeper connection between the Phantom and construction zones. Missing reports, scattered photographs, and hunches cemented the idea that the predator either worked in or had access to such locations. Witnesses continually mentioned area construction sites near disappearances, and workers reported seeing a man fitting the description, though never frequently enough to confirm his routine. Spencer leaned over the stack of reports piling on his desk, his temples drumming with exhaustion. We're onto him now, he thought. But knowing and proving were two different battles entirely. Until more pieces of the puzzle fell into place, the Phantom kept his stranglehold on the community, cloaked in mystery and fear, a community on edge. The police force wasn't the only group on high alert. Willowville's residents were no longer the same carefree populace they'd been months ago. Local stores couldn't keep mace or alarms in stock, and the streets emptied earlier with every passing day. Overhead news helicopters buzzed, broadcasting scenes of frantic search teams and tearful families, images that cemented the town's growing infamy while leaving its people yearning for peace. Still, as small as those first breakthroughs seemed, they carried one critical promise: the Phantom had a name, even if they didn't know it yet. For the first time in months, the terror-stricken town had a glimmer of hope. There was a trail now, faint and treacherous, leading ever closer toward the truth. The mysterious suspect. For months, the Willowville Police Department had only shadows and half-leads to chase. But finally, all the small clues, uncertain sightings and whispered fears started to coalesce into something more concrete. Something with a face and, more importantly, a name. That name was Alex Crawley. The intelligence had come through a mixture of chance and relentless detective work. A gas station owner on the edge of Willowville, frustrated by weeks of rumors and escalating fear, called in a tip after recognizing the composite sketch of the suspect displayed on the evening news. "There's this guy," the caller said, voice tense but certain. "Been coming around for years. Always looks like he's just passing through, but when he's here he acts strange." Detective C.D. Spencer immediately perked up at the description that followed. A tall man with lean features, often in dark clothing that didn't quite fit the season. The caller mentioned that Crawley usually arrived in a beat-up pickup truck with peeling forest green paint and parked far from any security cameras, as if consciously avoiding being recorded. "He buys gas in cash, keeps his hat low," the witness continued, "and there was always this smell, like oil or gasoline, but stronger, like he carried it with him." As Spencer dug deeper, he discovered that Alex Crawley wasn't just some drifter. He was a 39-year-old construction foreman who had recently moved to a secluded house on the edge of the dense woods bordering Willowville. While he had been largely under the radar in the community, his sporadic appearances had drawn quiet curiosity among his neighbors. People noticed he rarely spoke to others, and when he did, his words came out clipped and just polite enough to avoid suspicion. "He was just there," one neighbor told police. "You'd see him on his front porch sometimes, smoking, didn't socialize, didn't do anything to stand out, really, except—" The woman trailed off before finally whispering, "There was always something unsettling about him, like he didn't belong." A shroud of mystery. The deeper the police looked, the more they found Alex Crawley to be a textbook enigma. He had no criminal record, no glaring red flags, and few connections to anyone in the area. Background checks revealed he had moved between several towns in recent years, holding short-term construction jobs, many of them near major wooded areas. His history seemed ordinary enough, until someone dug deeper. One officer noticed a pattern among Crawley's past employments. Wherever he had lived, there was a subtle spike in missing persons reports, particularly young women. None of it had ever been connected to him. The disappearances were staggered, with years between them, and often dismissed as runaways or accidents. To the police, it began to look as if Crawley had been carefully honing his methods for years, never staying in one place too long, never leaving enough evidence to draw a clear link back to him. Perhaps the most unnerving discovery came from neighbors who lived closest to the woods surrounding Crawley's home. When questioned, many described strange noises late at night, heavy thuds, metal clanging, or even on rare occasions, distant screams that had been dismissed as wildlife. "It was weird," one man admitted. "But this is a small town, you know. Everyone's got their quirks and the forest is noisy. You don't think much of it, until now." Suspicion mounts. By now, investigators were beginning to see Crawley not as a question mark, but as the first real suspect in the grim saga tormenting Willowville. The only challenge, the man himself remained infuriatingly elusive. Officers attempted to surveil his property, but Crawley rarely showed signs of life. His blinds were perpetually drawn, and his truck, his battered, noise-polluted truck, was almost always parked in the same place. On the few occasions he did leave, it was either under the cover of night or to make brief, deliberate trips into town. One officer, assigned to follow Crawley's movements, reported an unnerving encounter just a week into his assignment. "I was parked a good distance away," the officer recounted, "just watching the house. It was quiet. Then, out of nowhere, he walks into the yard, like he knows I'm there, but he doesn't look toward me or anything. He just lights a cigarette and stands there, staring at the tree line. For a full 10 minutes he doesn't move, doesn't turn around. Just stands there, like he's not human. Like he's waiting for something." As the days passed, mounting evidence began to lend further weight to suspicions. Police photos taken from outside his property showed freshly dug patches of earth scattered around his yard, some large enough to suggest they could be hiding something. But without a warrant or clear cause to search, officers were forced to wait. The breaking point things took a decisive turn when detectives re-examined the timeline of Tanya Lewis's near abduction. Witnesses reported that a truck similar to Crawley's had been sighted near the university campus multiple times on the days leading up to, and the evening of, the incident. A check of traffic cameras on nearby highways revealed the faint outline of a vehicle resembling his, its taillights barely distinguishable against the darkened backdrop. What finally pushed investigators over the edge was a chilling account from a clerk at a hardware store one town over. When presented with Crawley's composite sketch, the clerk immediately recognized him. "Yeah, that guy came in here a couple weeks ago," she said, her face blanching as she spoke. "He bought rope, and duct tape, and this big roll of plastic sheeting. When I asked him what it was for, he just smiled and said it was for a project." C.D. Spencer listened to the clerk's statement in steely silence, but beneath his calm demeanor his blood ran cold. "We have enough now," he told his team later that evening. "It's time to bring this guy in before he disappears, just like his victims." The calm before the storm. Armed with a warrant, officers prepared to raid Crawley's property. The tension was palpable. Some of the town's most experienced officers described a gnawing feeling that they were stepping into something far bigger and far darker than they had anticipated. Inside the house, they hoped, would be the answers to months of fear and speculation. Crawley himself, however, remained the greatest unknown. No one could predict how a man so skilled at evasion and subterfuge would react when the walls began to close in. For Willowville, it felt like standing on the edge of a storm, waiting for the first crack of thunder to shatter the silence. The first pieces of evidence. The breakthrough that Willowville craved came in the unlikeliest of ways, through persistence, frustration, and a final stroke of luck. For months, investigators had been chasing shadows, relying on whispers, theories, and chilling patterns rather than tangible leads. But that began to change when the police finally searched Alex Crawley's beat-up pickup truck. Crawley was brought in for questioning on a rainy Tuesday evening, his truck impounded for forensic inspection. On the surface, the vehicle was unremarkable, though suitably eerie for a man of his nature. Its chipped green paint, aged tires, and the persistent whine of the engine mirrored its owner, worn and unassuming, but masking something far darker beneath the surface. Inside, officers found the expected clutter of a man who worked with his hands. Tools, oil-streaked rags, and empty food wrappers tossed carelessly on the passenger seat, but tucked under the driver's seat, hidden beneath layers of grime and dirt, lay an ominous discovery, a bundle of short strands of long, dark human hair tied together with a blood-stained ribbon. The forensic team worked tirelessly to examine the bundle. Lab results revealed that the hair was a genetic match to Emma Cartwright, the young university student whose shattered umbrella had been found weeks earlier outside her library's side entrance. The blood on the ribbon, however, posed an even greater mystery. It belonged to Mary Greer, the woman who had been discovered buried in a shallow grave months prior. Crawley denied everything, of course, brushing off the evidence as planted or coincidental. "Someone put that there," he hissed during his interrogation. "That isn't mine." But his protestations fell on deaf ears, as the small community could already sense the weight of proof gathering against him. A dark trail unveiled. As news of the hair and blood spread, the investigative team grew emboldened. Detectives turned a sharper eye toward Crawley's property, re-examining the oddities they documented during their initial surveillance. Freshly dug patches of soil scattered throughout his yard, large enough to conceal horrifying secrets. Though Crawley's lawyers attempted to block the search warrant extension, the mounting circumstantial evidence against him left them with little wiggle room. Within hours, officers descended on Crawley's property in a coordinated effort that would change the direction of the case forever. The search proved grueling, as every cabinet, corner, and hollow in the dilapidated house posed the potential for an unlimited number of horrors. But what truly chilled officers to the bone was the detached garage sitting at the edge of the property, its interior reeking of gasoline, rust, and decay. The garage of horrors. The garage was a chaotic labyrinth of tools, scrap metal, and construction equipment. In the far corner beneath a stained tarp, investigators uncovered what could only be described as an improvised hunting kit. Lengths of rope, duct tape, empty bottles of chloroform, a rusted shovel, and an array of surgical gloves. Some of the tools were streaked with substances later identified as dried blood, though years of wear and exposure had rendered them largely useless for DNA analysis. But the greatest shock came with the discovery of a pile of worn clothing shoved into the bottom of a rusted metal cabinet. Among the items was a blood-soaked scarf, a twisted, familiar shade of green. It didn't take long for investigators to identify it as Julie Foster's, yet another haunting remnant of one of Crawley's victims. Detective C.D. Spencer stood in silence as the team pieced together the crime scene. He couldn't shake the feeling of methodical cruelty that radiated from the disorganized chaos. "This man didn't just kill," Spencer muttered, more to himself than anyone around him. "He captured, stalked, prepared. This place was his lair, and every corner of it tells the same story. It was all a game to him." The backyard dig. The culmination of the search came when police revisited the fresh patches of dug-up soil on Crawley's property. Officers used cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar to comb the area, and the results were grim. In several spots, faint but undeniable traces of decomposition were detected. In one shallow grave near a line of trees, human remains were discovered wrapped in plastic sheeting, the same kind Crawley had been reported purchasing weeks earlier at a hardware store. Dental records confirmed the remains belonged to Lila Dean, the bride-to-be who had vanished just days before her wedding. Crawley's denials became hollow echoes as biological evidence tied him more definitively to Willowville's grim saga of missing women. Meanwhile, additional bones uncovered on the property, some fragmented, others badly decayed, hinted at even more victims whose stories remained untold. While forensic anthropologists worked painstakingly to piece together identities, the discovery deepened the collective horror hanging over Willowville as people grappled with the possibility that the nightmare extended far beyond the dozen known cases. Memory triggers. For Tanya Lewis, who had survived Crawley's attempt to abduct her months earlier, news of the evidence reopened wounds that had begun to scab over. Though physically unharmed, she had struggled for months with survivor's guilt, wondering why she escaped when others hadn't. When she was briefed on the findings, she quietly agreed to revisit her initial statement, hoping her memories of the man's demeanor and behavior might connect some dots for investigators. "It's not just what he did," she told Detective Spencer during a follow-up interview. "It's why. There was something so deliberate about him, like he wanted people to know he was smarter than everyone else. Everything about him felt calculated. He wasn't just taking us, he was playing with us." The evidence takes shape. By the fall of 1982, Crawley's truck and property were brimming with evidence, both physical and circumstantial, painting an increasingly sinister picture of a man driven by control, cruelty, and an obsessive desire for invisibility. Fibers, blood, and hair samples recovered from the crime scene linked Crawley, or at least his tools, to multiple victims. A knife found in his possession bore scratches consistent with bone markings found on several of the remains unearthed near his home. While Crawley continued to insist on his innocence and claimed the evidence was planted to frame him, a chilling reality began to come into focus for investigators. Alex Crawley wasn't new to this game. He was meticulous, careful, and coldly strategic, but at some point, he had grown comfortable, too comfortable, and begun to make mistakes. And now, those mistakes were surfacing, exposing the trail of destruction he had spent years perfecting how to hide. The Town React's news of the findings sent ripples of shock and outrage through the already traumatized town. Parents held their daughters closer, locks were double-checked on every window, and churches filled with people praying for closure as more remains were identified. The discovery of physical evidence against Crawley confirmed what many had feared all along. The predator had been one of them, living among the community and moving silently, like a ghost in their midst. For Willowville, the uncovering of Alex Crawley's secrets signaled that the nightmare might not last forever. But it also answered one haunting question with a terrifying certainty. There were far more victims than anyone had dared to imagine. The terrifying escape. By the fall of 1983, Alex Crawley's arrest was a tightly wound secret the police department could barely contain. The people of Willowville had finally exhaled their collective breath, believing that the nightmare was over. For many, the image of Crawley sitting behind bars was enough to soothe months of sleepless nights. But what no one, including the police, anticipated was that Crawley wasn't finished yet. His escape would not only plunge the town back into despair, but also solidify his legend as a predator who could not be caged. A chilling calm before the storm. In the weeks leading up to Crawley's escape, there had been murmurs among some of the guards at the county detention center. Something about the way Crawley carried himself didn't sit right. He wasn't loud or defiant like many prisoners awaiting trial. Instead, he kept to himself, his face an unreadable mask of calm calculation. He was quiet, too quiet, a guard would later recall during a press conference. You'd expect a guy like him to show some kind of emotion, anger, fear, something, but it was like he was above it all. Crawley spent his days observing everything. He noted the guards' schedules, the times when shift changes created gaps in surveillance, and even which officers were more likely to enjoy a cigarette break in the courtyard. Despite his looming trial, where the evidence against him seemed insurmountable, he gave the impression of someone who still believed he was in control. Detective C.D. Spencer had picked up on this during one of his interrogations. "He wasn't broken," Spencer later told reporters, staring into the camera with a grim expression. "He wasn't even concerned. That's what scared me the most. He made you feel like you were part of a game he was playing, and he was already 3 moves ahead." The rainy night. It was a night like any other, darkened by heavy rain and rolling thunder. The storm had been forecasted for days, but no one paid it much mind. It was just another autumn night in Willowville. Inside the detention center, however, the storm provided the perfect cover for Crawley's meticulously planned escape. At approximately 11:28 p.m., during the nightly head count, a guard noticed Crawley in his bunk, seemingly asleep under a thin, tattered blanket. His unmoving figure was so convincingly lifeless that no one suspected a thing. But when the guard returned hours later to deliver a routine meal, he found the bunk empty. The blanket had been draped over a mound of pillows, and the room's only vent, a small rectangular opening along the ceiling, was hanging loosely, its screws discarded on the floor like breadcrumbs. Panic erupted immediately. Crawley had vanished. How he did it. The full scope of Crawley's escape would take weeks to piece together. Investigators found that the killer had carefully disassembled the screws of the vent over the course of several nights using a piece of broken metal smuggled in from the cafeteria. He had hidden the tool every day in the lining of his mattress, biding his time until the guards grew complacent. The vent itself led to a narrow crawl space that snaked above the entire detention center, a particular design flaw that authorities would later be harshly criticized for. Crawley's slim build and athletic frame allowed him to move through the tight quarters with little difficulty, though bloody smears later recovered from the crawl space suggested he wasn't unscathed. The crawl space ended near the facility's service yard, where water tanks, dumpsters, and old equipment sat rusting in the rain. Crawley descended into the yard undetected, using the ongoing storm as cover. Surveillance footage, grainy and obscured by the downpour, later showed him climbing a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. After that, he melted into the darkness. A sinister warning. News of Crawley's escape sent shockwaves through Willowville. People who had started to feel safe again found themselves locking their doors and windows with shaking hands. Local stores that had stopped stocking pepper spray and home locks suddenly saw their shelves cleared out within hours. But the most chilling moment came just days after Crawley disappeared, when prison authorities discovered a note left behind in his cell. Scribbled hastily on the back of a cafeteria menu, the message read, "I told you I didn't belong here. I'm not done yet." For Detective Spencer, the note was the stuff of nightmares. "He's taunting us," he admitted during a press briefing. "This isn't just about running. This is about sending a message. To us, to the town, to his victims' families. He wants us to know he's still in control." The manhunt authorities launched one of the largest manhunts in state history, mobilizing local, state, and even federal forces. Helicopters circled the surrounding woods for days, their floodlights carving bright paths through the dense canopy. Bloodhounds were brought in to chase Crawley's scent, but the relentless rain had washed away most of his trail. Roadblocks were set up across major highways. Officers were stationed at gas stations, truck stops, and diners within a 50-mile radius, questioning anyone who looked even remotely suspicious. But Crawley was a master of disappearing acts. Days turned into weeks, and still, there was no sign of him. As time stretched on, the media began to spin Crawley's escape into something almost mythical. Headlines declared, "The Phantom strikes again and killer vanishes like smoke." Somewhere out there, they speculated, a man capable of unimaginable evil was free, and no one knew where or when he might strike next. The town's breakdown Willowville fell into chaos. Parents refused to let their children walk to school alone. Women, especially those with long dark hair resembling Crawley's preferred victims, trimmed their hair short or dyed it bright colors to feel less like targets. Even the boldest of the town's residents avoided going out after sunset. "It feels like we're prisoners in our own homes," one resident said on the evening news, her voice shaking as she clutched her young daughter's hand. "Every shadow looks like him. Every noise outside makes you think he's coming for you." Churches held nightly vigils, gathering frightened townspeople to pray for Crawley's capture. Law enforcement faced growing pressure from state officials, with many residents openly questioning how it had been possible for a man so dangerous to slip through their fingers. The lingering fear. For weeks, Crawley's ghost haunted Willowville. Sporadic sightings were reported: a lean figure at a gas station, a shadowy man smoking on the outskirts of town, but none could be confirmed. Each dead-end lead only added to the growing dread that Crawley wasn't just hiding. He was waiting. For what? No one could say. For Willowville, it was as if the nightmare had rolled back into town, shrouded in storm clouds and whispers of fear. Crawley had done what he always did best, vanish before anyone could stop him. But this time his escape carried an ominous promise, a guarantee that even with stolen freedom, Alex Crawley's reign of terror wasn't over. The final run. For nearly a year, Alex Crawley remained a spectral presence in the collective consciousness of Willowville and beyond. His daring escape, combined with his reputation as a master manipulator and predator, had catapulted him to infamy not just within the state but across the entire country. The people of Willowville could sense him like a cold breeze on the back of their necks, even though no one knew where he had fled. Every shadowed alley, every broken-down truck on the side of the road, and every missing persons report sparked the dread that the Phantom was still out there, preparing to strike again. And in the summer of 1984, he did. A return to darkness. It started quietly, the way most tragedies do. An unassuming report filed in a rural mountain community more than 300 miles south of Willowville. The report concerned a young woman, Marissa Holland, who had disappeared after finishing her evening shift at a local diner. Her car was found abandoned on a gravel road near the edge of the woods, the driver's side door left ajar. The only clue left behind was a crushed pack of cigarettes on the ground, its plastic wrapper glinting faintly in the moonlight. The connection to Crawley wasn't clear at first. Local police treated the disappearance as yet another missing persons case, all too common in an isolated mountain area with dark forests and lonely roads. But then came the second report. Just 2 weeks after Marissa vanished, another woman disappeared, this time from a campsite several miles deeper into the mountains. Lori Jensen, a teacher on summer break, had been traveling alone, documenting her journey through photographs and journal entries. Her abandoned tent was found torn open, its contents scattered, but not stolen. A journal entry written just 2 days before her disappearance described a man with a limp who had come into her campsite just after sunset to ask for directions. When the police read this, alarm bells began to ring. They forwarded the information to state authorities, who immediately contacted Willowville investigators. What had started as isolated reports began to take on the unsettling scent of Crawley's calculated chaos. Crawley's final mistake. While Crawley had managed to stay one step ahead for nearly a year, it was his carelessness during the next phase of his flight that tipped the scales. A hiker stumbled upon his green pickup truck, partially disguised by branches and parked deep along an old mountain trail. Its distinctive peeling paint, combined with other identifying details broadcast nationwide, left no doubt. It was the Phantom's truck. Inside the vehicle, investigators found a chilling assortment of items: rolls of duct tape, lengths of twine, a shovel streaked with dirt, and most horrifyingly, a pair of women's shoes. The police were now certain Crawley hadn't stopped. He was still hunting. The discovery of the truck reignited the years-long manhunt, this time with new fervor. Helicopters scoured the mountain ridges, their powerful spotlights cutting through the dense tree cover. Search teams combed the forests in grid formations, their radios crackling with updates. Bloodhounds were called in once again, this time successfully picking up a trail that led deeper into the wilderness. The Cabin of Shadows. As the search intensified, authorities narrowed their focus to a remote area of the mountain range. The trail eventually led them to a weather-worn, abandoned hunting cabin perched precariously on the edge of a rocky cliff. Its windows were boarded up from the inside, and the door was reinforced with crude but effective barricades. When officers approached the cabin, they found fresh evidence of recent use: footprints in the dirt outside, a half-extinguished fire pit, and scraps of food wrappers scattered haphazardly. A quiet fear rippled through the officers as they realized they had likely found Crawley's hideout, his final refuge. Detective C.D. Spencer, who had been called in to help coordinate the operation, issued strict orders to proceed cautiously. Crawley was no ordinary fugitive. He was cunning, unpredictable, and dangerous. Every move had to be calculated. As the tactical team surrounded the cabin, the tension was electric. The officers steadied their breaths and tightened their grips on their weapons, prepared for the possibility of violence. Crawley, however, seemed to sense that the game was coming to an end. Through a crack in the boarded-up window, officers spotted him sitting motionless in a chair near the fireplace. His head was tilted slightly downward, and his hands rested calmly on his knees. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't running anymore. He was waiting. The final stand. When officers breached the cabin, Crawley didn't resist. He raised his hands slowly, the faintest of smirks playing on his face. "Took you long enough," he muttered, his voice cold and measured, as if he were greeting an old friend. The tactical team apprehended him without a struggle. Yet, despite his capture, the scene inside the cabin revealed the depth of Crawley's horrifying legacy. A table cluttered with maps, photographs, and journal entries suggested he had been planning his movements for months, carefully plotting his next set of victims. In one corner of the cabin, officers found a chilling display: trophies from his victims. Personal items, jewelry, and scraps of clothing were stashed in a wooden chest, a macabre reminder of the lives he had taken. The discovery deepened the grim realization that Crawley had been at work even during his time on the run, leaving a trail of uncounted victims across lonely backroads and remote campsites. The Town Reacts news of Crawley's capture spread like wildfire, first reaching Willowville and then rippling across the nation. For the residents of the small lakeside town, it felt like the lifting of a suffocating weight, a collective exhale after years of holding their breath. Families of the victims gathered in vigil, lighting candles not just to mourn those they had lost but to celebrate the fact that Crawley had finally been stopped. But even with Crawley behind bars once again, the wounds he left behind bled fresh. His victims' families were left to grapple with the knowledge that many of their loved ones would never be found. His crimes had stretched far beyond what anyone in Willowville had initially imagined, leaving scars on communities across the region. Crawley's cryptic words. During his final interrogation, Crawley offered no remorse. Instead, he leaned into his role as the monster the world now knew him to be. "You'll never know everything," he said, a faint glimmer of triumph in his dark eyes. "There are things I've done, places I've been, that you'll never figure out, and even if you do, you won't find them all." His cryptic words rattled even the most seasoned detectives. Crawley wasn't just a murderer, he was a manipulator who thrived on control, even in defeat. As he was led away in handcuffs, a reporter shouted the question on everyone's mind: "Why, Alex, why did you do it?" Crawley paused, turning his head slightly toward the camera, his lips curled into a chilling smile. "Why not? All roads lead to justice." The final phase of Crawley's story was inevitable, a trial that would expose the true horrors of his crimes. But one thing was clear to everyone: this time, there would be no escape. The dramatic trial. The trial of Alex Crawley began in late 1984 under the blinding glare of media attention. It wasn't just a courtroom spectacle, it was a psychological battleground that exposed the depths of Crawley's crimes and the charisma of a man capable of chilling manipulation. For the families of the victims and the residents of Willowville, the trial wasn't just about justice. It was a last chance to confront the man who had turned their small, peaceful town into a nationwide symbol of terror. The setting. The courthouse was unremarkable from the outside, the kind of subdued brick building you might pass on a quiet street without a second glance. But on the inside, nothing was quiet. Security was razor-sharp, with metal detectors at every entrance, armed officers stationed in every hallway, and federal agents keeping an eye on the outskirts to ensure Crawley didn't pull off another escape. The gallery was packed daily with a mix of journalists, families of the victims, and stunned locals who still couldn't believe that the Phantom of Willowville had been caught. Outside, news vans swarmed like insects, reporters shouting updates into cameras as a sea of angry townsfolk waved signs that read, justice for Willowville and never again. The trial promised not only to dissect Crawley's chilling crimes but to answer the haunting question gnawing at everyone: what kind of man could commit such unspeakable acts? Crawley in court. When Crawley was led into the courtroom, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. He was calm, eerily composed, his hair neatly combed, dressed in a plain suit that felt almost ridiculous against the backdrop of his crimes. His expression betrayed no fear, no shame, no anger, only a faint smile that some described as smug. He moved with a confidence that unsettled everyone present, as if he still believed he was in control. He had this look, Tanya Lewis said when asked about seeing Crawley again. She had been called to testify against him. Like he was smarter than all of us, like none of this mattered to him, because in his mind he'd already won. The prosecution team knew that this wasn't just a legal battle. It was a psychological one. They needed to dismantle Crawley's godlike confidence and prove, beyond any doubt, that he wasn't just a man accused of murder, but a methodical, remorseless predator with no regard for human life. The evidence unfolds. The first few days of the trial were devoted to laying out the sprawling web of evidence against Crawley. The prosecution opened with a chilling statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," began Mary Foster, the lead prosecutor, her voice resolute, cutting through the silence, "you will hear about crimes so calculated, so deliberate, that they defy comprehension. Alex Crawley didn't kill out of anger or passion. He killed because he could, because he wanted to prove he was untouchable. And today, we're going to show you, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that he isn't." Piece by piece, the prosecution built its case. Forensic experts laid out the grisly details of the evidence found in Crawley's truck, home, and storage shed. The blood-soaked scarf belonging to Julie Foster, the hair and ribbon tied to Emma Cartwright, the plastic-wrapped remains of Lila Dean, unearthed from his backyard. Each was presented with clinical precision, accompanied by photographs that left the jury visibly shaken. But perhaps the most damning evidence came in the form of Crawley's journals, recovered from the hunting cabin during his final arrest. Prosecutors revealed pages of meticulous notes about his victims: times, dates, routines, physical descriptions. Crawley had written about his crimes like a scientist documenting experiments, debasing his victims to nothing more than entries in his morbid catalog. "He wasn't just hunting them," the prosecutor said, holding up one of the journals for the jury to see. "He was studying them, planning every move, every detail, and when he finally struck, it wasn't an accident. It was the culmination of weeks, sometimes months, of deliberate preparation." The survivors speak. When Tanya Lewis took the stand, the room fell deathly silent. She was the sole survivor of Crawley's calculated attacks, the one who had gotten away. Her composure as she recounted the night she encountered Crawley was both heartbreaking and heroic. "I remember how polite he was," she began, clasping her hands tightly in front of her. "He didn't look dangerous, he looked harmless, like someone who couldn't hurt a fly. But then, when I saw his eyes up close, I knew something was off. There was nothing in them, no emotion, no anger, just emptiness." She recounted the moment Crawley reached for the cord hidden in his pocket, the cold realization that he had set a trap for her. The courtroom sat frozen as she described throwing a textbook into his face and sprinting for her life, the sound of his curses echoing behind her. When asked if she could identify her attacker in the room, Tanya didn't hesitate. She turned, pointing directly at Crawley without a tremor of doubt in her voice. "It's him," she said. "I'll never forget his face." The defense scrambles. Crawley's court-appointed defense team was woefully unprepared to counter the tidal wave of evidence against their client. Their only hope lay in claiming that the physical evidence had been planted or mishandled, and that the journals didn't definitively prove intent. But Crawley himself made their job nearly impossible. He showed no interest in cooperating, occasionally smirking or leaning back in his chair, his body language exuding indifference. When asked by his lawyers if he wished to take the stand to defend himself, Crawley surprised them by agreeing almost immediately. "Why not?" he replied with a shrug. "Let them hear from me." Crawley's testimony. If the courtroom had been tense before, Crawley's testimony pushed it to the edge of breaking. Taking the stand, Crawley spoke with a calm, measured cadence as though he were giving a lecture instead of responding to allegations of murder. "I never understood why people care so much about laws," he said early in his testimony, his words sending a chill through the room. "Laws are just rules meant to control the weak, the strong. We make our own rules." He didn't deny being at the scenes of the crimes, but insisted that he had been framed by the media and the police, portraying himself as a misunderstood recluse who had been targeted because he didn't fit into society, but his arrogance betrayed him. At one point under cross-examination, Crawley made an offhand comment that caused the courtroom to audibly gasp. "I only regret one thing," he said with an unsettling grin, "that I didn't get to finish what I started." The prosecutor seized on the moment, hammering him with questions that forced him to contradict himself and exposing the cracks in his thin facade. By the time his testimony concluded, the jury's decision felt almost inevitable: the verdict. After 6 grueling weeks, the trial came to its dramatic conclusion. The jury deliberated for just 4 hours, a remarkably short time given the complexity of the case. The foreperson rose, her voice steady but heavy with emotion. "On the charges of murder, kidnapping, and aggravated assault, we, the jury, find the defendant, Alex Crawley, guilty." The gallery erupted in sobs of relief and cheers of triumph, though many wept for the lives that could never be brought back. Crawley showed no reaction as the verdict was read, his expression as emotionless as ever, though his eyes gleamed with a faint flicker of something, pride perhaps that he had cemented his infamy. Justice at last. For the town of Willowville, the trial marked both an ending and a beginning, a long-overdue reckoning for Alex Crawley, and a chance for the community to heal from a nightmare they never saw coming. Though Crawley would spend the rest of his days awaiting execution in a high-security prison, his words during the trial lingered like shadows, reminding those who heard them that monsters don't always hide under beds. Sometimes they live among us, smiling politely, waiting for their moment to strike. The final reckoning. There was a buzzing stillness in the air as Alex Crawley's ultimate judgment approached, a grim punctuation mark on one of the darkest chapters in recent history. By the time he was handed the sentence of death by lethal injection, Alex Crawley had become one of America's most infamous criminals, a living embodiment of evil for the residents of Willowville, a shadow across their otherwise peaceful town. But Crawley's end was far from clean. Even as the day of his execution loomed, he maintained an unnerving control over his narrative, casting a chilling pall over the attempt to bring closure to his victims and their families. A monster unrepentant, Crawley's final days were spent in solitary confinement in a maximum security prison, monitored by guards who had been briefed on his past escapes and cunning. To prevent any remaining risk of him slipping through their fingers one last time, his cell was stripped bare, every object bolted down or padded to ensure he had no opportunity to engineer another breakout. But it was Crawley himself who left the guards on edge. He didn't rail or lash out like others on death row. He wasn't bitter or despondent. Instead, he was eerily calm, like a man who knew he had already etched his name into history books. Journalists fought for exclusives, desperate to secure even a word from him. Crawley, ever the manipulator, granted only one interview, an unsettling conversation that would haunt the reporter for the rest of his life. When asked if he felt remorse for his actions, Crawley tilted his head, his lips curling into that faint familiar smirk. "Remorse?" he repeated, as if the word itself were foreign to him. "You ask that because you assume I see the world the way you do. That's your first mistake." The reporter pressed further, his voice shaking slightly. "But why? Why take so many lives?" Crawley leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper but carrying a razor-sharp edge. "Because I could. Because no one ever stopped me." The chilling confession. 3 days before Crawley's execution, he called for a meeting with his legal team and, shockingly, with Detective C.D. Spencer, the man who had relentlessly pursued him through every dark turn of his story. Spencer, wary but unable to refuse, found himself face to face with Crawley in the sterile confines of a prison visitation room. "I wanted to give you a parting gift," Crawley said, his voice smooth, as if they were old friends trading goodbyes. "You've got nothing I want," Spencer replied, his tone cold. Crawley gave a low chuckle. "Oh, I think you'll want this. You see, you've only scratched the surface, Detective." Over the next 2 hours, Crawley dropped bombshell after bombshell, confessing to the murders of 18 women, far more than the 12 originally linked to him. He recounted each with chilling clarity, offering details that only the killer could know: the forest trail, where he buried Anna Moore, whose disappearance had baffled police in a neighboring state; the shallow creek where he dumped the remains of Linda Perez, another name added to the growing list of the dead. But Crawley refused to give complete closure. On at least 6 of the confessions, he deliberately withheld the exact locations of the bodies. "That's for me to know," he said with a sly smile, "and for you to spend the rest of your life wondering about." Don't you love a good mystery detective? Spencer left the room, his mind racing with a mixture of fury, helplessness, and a grudging respect for just how insidious Crawley truly was. The confessions added weight to the case against the killer, but they also sharpened the unresolved edges of grief for the families still searching for their missing loved ones. The execution. The execution itself became a national spectacle, televised on a slight delay to prevent any unplanned disruptions. People across the country gathered around their TVs, not to witness justice, but to witness the monster finally extinguished. In Willowville, crowds gathered around the town square where a projector displayed the live feed of the prison's final preparation. Inside the prison, Crawley remained composed, his smirk intact, even as he was strapped onto the gurney in the antiseptic execution chamber. His last words echoed through the observation room, their quiet menace sending shivers through the gathered witnesses. "You know," he said, his voice calm, "you may kill me, but you'll never bury what I've done. That will live on longer than all of you." It was not regret, it was not peace. It was Crawley doubling down on his legacy, staking his claim to infamy even as the needle slid into his arm. The lethal injection proceeded without complications. At 8:17 p.m., Alex Crawley was declared dead. His body went limp, and the smirk finally faded. A community forever changed for the people of Willowville. Crawley's execution was supposed to bring closure, but as the days passed it became clear that his shadow would never truly leave. Families of his victims, especially those whose remains had never been found, were left to mourn in a limbo of unresolved grief. Churches held vigils for the unnamed souls Crawley had hinted at in his final confessions, hoping to find peace in the face of so much unknown. In bookstores, Crawley's story began appearing on shelves, sold under titles like Hunting the Phantom and the Mind of a Predator. Documentaries and true crime specials chronicled his horrifying life and the devastating impact he had on dozens of families and communities. For some, the attention felt like an insult, as if it glorified the man who had stolen so much. Detective Spencer, who had spent years of his life chasing Crawley, quietly retired within a year of the trial's conclusion. Though he never spoke publicly about the case again, friends described him as a man forever haunted by the killer's final words in the visitation room. An ongoing mystery. Even in death, Crawley's legacy continued to baffle law enforcement agencies across the country. Cold cases that bore similarities to his methods began surfacing in states as far away as Oregon and Texas, prompting collaboration among multiple departments. Every few months, a new team of investigators would uncover a shallow grave or an abandoned campsite, and the question would inevitably arise: was this another of Crawley's victims? Each discovery reignited the mystery, casting doubt on whether Crawley had truly revealed the full scope of his crimes. One seasoned detective put it best in an interview years later. Crawley didn't just kill people, he took pieces of them, pieces of their families, pieces of this country. And the worst part is, he knew exactly what he was doing. He was clever enough to make sure people would never stop looking over their shoulders, even after he's gone. A lesson in darkness. The story of Alex Crawley became more than a cautionary tale. It was a grim reminder of the darkness that can live among us, hidden behind polite smiles and normal lives. Willowville, once a quiet and trusting community, remained scarred but vigilant. Self-defense classes became more common, neighborhood watch programs expanded, and the notion of "it could never happen here" disappeared forever. If Crawley's reign of terror had taught them anything, it was this: evil doesn't knock on the front door, it slips in through the cracks when no one is looking. The aftermath. When the curtain finally fell on Alex Crawley's terrifying saga, the world wanted to move on. News stations shifted their focus to new tragedies and scandals, books and documentaries exhausted the grim details of his crimes, and the public breathed a collective sigh of relief now that justice had been served. But for the families of his victims and the residents of Willowville, relief could only bring so much peace. The aftermath of Crawley's reign of terror was not something that could be neatly packaged in a trial or contained within prison walls. The echoes of his crimes rippled out far beyond the quiet lakeside town he once stalked. For those who had been touched by his darkness, Crawley's death didn't mark the end of the story. It was simply another chapter in a trauma they would carry for the rest of their lives. Families forever broken. For the families of the victims, the weight of Crawley's legacy was heavier than any courtroom verdict or execution could lift. These were people who had spent years waiting for answers, only to learn of the brutal fates their daughters, wives, or sisters had endured. Among them was the Jensen family, grieving the loss of Lori Jensen, the teacher whose journal first provided police with an important clue. Her father, Robert, broke down in tears during a press interview after the execution. "I don't think there's such a thing as moving on," he said, his voice shaking. "You can bury the killer, but you can't bury the hole he left in our lives." For others, closure was harder to grasp. Sarah Moore, whose sister Anna had been one of Crawley's earliest and long unsolved victims, stood in the back of the vigil held in Willowville's town square. "He took her, and he took the answers," Sarah said quietly. "He said he'd tell us where she was, but he never did, and now he never will. How do you find peace in that?" Crawley's refusal to disclose the location of certain victims' remains was perhaps the cruelest blow of all. Even with the evidence uncovered on his property and his final confessions, the whereabouts of at least 6 women remained unknown. Their families were left in a state of limbo, grieving loved ones they could never properly lay to rest. A town rebuilt on fear. Willowville was not the same town it had been before Crawley first appeared. What had once been a tight-knit, idyllic community had become a place of quiet suspicion and constant caution. The town square, once bustling with kids riding bikes and neighbors waving at each other, was now filled with dark glances and strangers walking briskly with their heads down. Locksmiths saw a sudden boom in business as families replaced old locks with state-of-the-art security systems. Self-defense classes popped up at the local recreation center, teaching women how to escape from impossible situations and how to wield pepper spray. More than a few households opted for even more drastic measures. A box of ammunition became a common sight in pantries, sitting beside cans of soup and boxes of cereal. "You don't think about these things in a place like this," said Mark Delaney, owner of Willowville's longest-standing diner. "We used to leave our doors unlocked. Now people are buying guns. It's like the whole world went wrong overnight." Lingering shadows. Crawley's ability to blend in with the community before his arrest continued to haunt Willowville. It wasn't just the horror of what he had done. It was the realization that he had done it while living unnoticed among them. He had shopped at their grocery stores, driven along their streets, maybe even smiled at their kids. For Jessica Matthews, knowing that Crawley had been so close to her family was a recurring nightmare. Her sister had gone to the same college where Crawley lurked, and Jessica couldn't stop replaying the scenarios in her head. "He could have walked past me at the gas station," she told the local newspaper. "He could have been standing behind me in line at the bank." How do you unlearn that kind of fear? The media frenzy. Though Crawley's execution was the end of his physical existence, his story took on a life of its own in the years that followed. Publishers churned out true crime novels and exposés dissecting every detail of his methods and motives. Television networks aired specials and documentaries billing Crawley as one of America's most cunning killers. Crime podcasts dedicated episodes to unraveling his psychology, his ability to evade capture, and his final, chilling, cryptic statements. "You'll never bury what I've done." Not everyone appreciated the media feeding frenzy. For the families of the victims, seeing Crawley's face plastered on every screen and his name sensationalized felt like a fresh wound. Jillian Cartwright, the mother of Emma Cartwright, said, "Why are we still talking about him? He stole enough from us. Stop turning him into a celebrity." But there was no denying the public's morbid fascination. Crawley had tapped into a primal part of humanity's psyche: fear, curiosity, disgust. He was a puzzle people wanted to solve, even though the solution offered no comfort. Detective Spencer's quiet farewell. For Detective C.D. Spencer, the man who had led the charge to bring Crawley to justice, the aftermath was deeply personal. He had spent years unraveling Crawley's web, chasing down clues and facing dead ends that nearly drove him to despair. In the end, he had put the Phantom behind bars, but the victory felt hollow. "There's no such thing as winning in cases like this," a retired Spencer told a journalist years later. "You don't win when you put the devil away. You just make sure he can't hurt anyone else." Spencer quietly retired in 1986, citing burnout. Though he had given no official interviews at the time, his colleagues believed Crawley's cryptic final words haunted the detective. The thought that there might still be women buried in unmarked graves, families waiting for answers that would never come, weighed heavily on him. A close friend later admitted, Spencer never stopped looking over his shoulder. He never truly left the case behind. An ongoing search for justice. Even in death, Crawley's crimes continued to baffle law enforcement across the country. His methods, while barbaric, had forced investigators to work harder, smarter, and more collaboratively to connect cold cases. Over the years, graves resembling those uncovered at Crawley's property were found in other states: Indiana, Michigan, Pennsylvania. Investigators couldn't confirm all were connected to Crawley, but the sheer number of similar patterns raised troubling questions. Could Crawley have operated far wider than anyone imagined? And how many women had truly fallen victim to his brutality? An FBI spokesperson remarked during an interview in 1990, years after Crawley's execution, "What we know is horrifying. What we don't know is even worse." A necessary vigilance. For many, the story of Alex Crawley became a cautionary tale, a dark reminder of the evil that can hide in plain sight. Willowville's once naive sense of security never truly returned, but it was replaced by something else: vigilance. Parents became more mindful of their children's whereabouts. Neighbors paid closer attention to who moved in and out of their community. Churches began offering counseling services, trying to rebuild a sense of collective trust that had been shattered. Crawley's shadow still lingered, but the people of Willowville were determined not to let it define them. "He wanted to destroy us," said one resident. "He didn't win. We're still here. We're scared, sure, but we're also stronger." The lasting legacy. In the end, Alex Crawley's true legacy was not just the lives he took, but the change he brought to law enforcement, community practices, and even the way people saw each other. His reign of terror became a symbol of both unspeakable evil and the resilience needed to confront it. Willowville, though forever marked by its time in Crawley's grasp, survived. And survival, when looking into the face of pure darkness, is its own kind of victory. Lessons and warnings. The story of Alex Crawley was one of darkness, of a predator who hid in plain sight, manipulating and preying for years before his capture. But for the people of Willowville and the world at large, his crimes became more than ghastly headlines. They were a wake-up call, a reminder of the fragility of safety and the cost of complacency. Crawley's reign of terror forced communities, law enforcement, and even families to confront hard truths about the nature of evil, the blind spots in society, and the pressing need for vigilance. Though Alex Crawley was gone, the lessons he left in his wake would reverberate for generations. Evil is closer than we think. In the aftermath of Crawley's crimes, one question lingered in everyone's mind: how did no one see him for what he was? He wasn't a shadowy figure haunting alleyways or a rogue drifter passing through towns unnoticed. He was a neighbor, someone who waved politely at strangers, worked construction jobs, and shopped in the same stores as his victims. This realization rattled not just the small town of Willowville but communities across the country. Crawley's ability to blend in, to appear ordinary while concealing monstrous intent, made people reevaluate how they interact with others. "He bought coffee from me," said Carla Green, the owner of a small cafe Crawley had frequented. "I served him coffee every Thursday morning for almost a year. He smiled, tipped well, and asked me about my kids. How are you supposed to know someone like that is a killer?" This horrifying thought gnawed at residents beyond Willowville. Crawley wasn't an anomaly. He was a cruel reminder that evil often wears a mask of normalcy, one that allows predators like him to slip unnoticed into the fabric of everyday life. The danger of ignoring red flags. One of the chilling revelations about Crawley's time in Willowville was the number of warning signs that had been brushed aside. Whispered accounts of him wandering late at night, witnesses recalling his creepy demeanor when he shopped for items like duct tape, rope, and plastic sheeting. Yet these moments, though strange, were dismissed as insignificant at the time. As the details of Crawley's methodology came to light, criminologists pointed to an alarming pattern. Too often people dismiss their own instincts in favor of politeness or disbelief. "We're told as kids not to judge others too quickly, to give people the benefit of the doubt," said Dr. Emily Hargrave, a psychologist who analyzed Crawley's behavior. And while kindness and understanding are valuable, Crawley's crimes prove that humans have instincts for a reason. If something feels wrong or someone makes you uncomfortable, listen to that feeling. It may save your life. These points sparked national conversations about trust, personal safety, and learning to balance compassion with awareness, the strength and shortcomings of law enforcement. For law enforcement, the Crawley case was both a sobering failure and a catalyst for improvement. His ability to evade detection for years, cross state lines without raising suspicion, and ultimately escape from custody highlighted gaping holes in the system. And yet, it also became a moment of reckoning, one that forced agencies to evolve. Following Crawley's final capture, an unprecedented level of cooperation emerged between local, state, and federal law enforcement. Databases were updated and shared more frequently, and task forces dedicated to tracking patterns of serial crimes were created. Smaller departments, like the one in Willowville, received training on how to recognize and respond to potential predators early. Still, many officers struggled to reconcile their late success with the damage Crawley had caused. "Wasn't enough," said retired Detective Henry Alvarez, who had worked on Crawley's manhunt. "We caught him, sure, but not before he hurt all those women. If we'd had the tools we have now back then, maybe it would have ended sooner." A cultural shift towards vigilance. The story of Alex Crawley also brought with it a cultural shift, one that extended far beyond law enforcement. It planted seeds of hyper-awareness in everyday life. People in Willowville changed. Families locked doors they once left open. Dark streets were avoided. Strangers weren't trusted with the same warm ease they had been before. But the profound impact wasn't just felt in Willowville. Across the country, parents taught their children how to recognize danger and avoid risky situations. Schools began offering personal safety workshops, teaching young adults, especially women, how to defend themselves, escape from dangerous situations, and even how to spot manipulation. For many, the lessons weren't just about safety in relationships, but in everyday interactions. Self-defense classes surged in small towns and major cities alike, with one program in Oregon referring to themselves as Phantom Awareness Camps. "Before Crawley," said Melanie Jones, a self-defense instructor, "most people treated physical safety as something you only thought about when you traveled or lived in dangerous neighborhoods. But predators like him prove it can happen anywhere. Even the safest town can hide a monster." The role of media and moral responsibility. The media played an unavoidable role in keeping Crawley's story alive. Following his execution, the true crime genre experienced a boom. Documentaries, podcasts, and books about his crimes flooded shelves and airwaves, each examining some facet of his personality or methodology. But this surge wasn't universally welcomed. Though many saw these projects as a way of uncovering mistruths and providing closure, others believed they glorified Crawley. Families of the victims were especially vocal about their frustrations. "We have enough nightmares already," said Jill Cartwright, mother of Emma Cartwright. "Every time I see his face on the cover of a book, I feel like he's winning somehow, like the world is giving him exactly what he wanted, attention." This sparked a broader debate about how society should handle stories like Crawley's. Were they cautionary tales, or were they distractions that turned murderers into household names while victims became an afterthought? The lasting impact on Willowville, once known as a picturesque lakeside town, became synonymous with tragedy. Crawley's story turned it into a place people whispered about, a darkened point on the map. Yet over time, the people of Willowville began to reclaim their identity, determined to survive and move forward together. In the years after Crawley's execution, the town gathered annually to remember the women whose lives he stole. Families planted trees in their honor, each one growing as a symbol of perseverance. The scars remained, but so did a fierce determination to keep the community safe. "We'll never forget," said Pastor Daniel Reeves, who led many of the memorial vigils. "But we can choose to live in fear, or we can choose to learn from what happened and refuse to let it define us. Alex Crawley didn't end this town, he didn't win." The broader warning: if there was one overarching lesson from Crawley's story, it was the reminder that evil doesn't always look like a horror movie villain. It doesn't show up with dramatic music or a clear warning. It can be mundane, polite, quiet. But that doesn't mean we're powerless against it. Crawley's reign of terror led to changes in how we approach safety, how we spot manipulation, and how seriously we take the warning signs that once seemed insignificant. His story became a testament to human resilience, showing that even when faced with unspeakable darkness, individuals and communities can confront it and emerge stronger. As one Willowville resident put it, "The world isn't divided into good and evil as clearly as we'd like to think. Sometimes people wear masks, but masks slip. You just have to pay attention when they do." Moving forward. Years after Crawley's death, his name still carries weight. In hushed tones or cautionary tales, his crimes serve as both a specter of the past and a reason to remain vigilant for the future. In Willowville and across the nation, Crawley forced a difficult but necessary truth into the spotlight. Security cannot be taken for granted. In the end, perhaps the greatest lesson comes not from Crawley himself, but from the people he left behind. Despite the fear, the trauma, and the scars, there remains an unwavering drive to protect one another, to rebuild what was broken, and to ensure that predators like Crawley never have the opportunity to thrive again. As Willowville's motto, painted on the town hall after Crawley's capture, so simply says, "Never again."